Hey everybody, thanks for participating in this extra meeting. I am sorry that I failed to bring up the prospect of it at the end of our previous meeting. We just got jammed for time and I forgot, but we wanted to have Andrew talk with us about this presentation uh, earlier in the year, but things got scrambled around, and so Andrew's about to leave, and he's going to be joining the Portland MPO. He'll tell us the proper name for it, and so we're going to get that presentation that we were hoping to get today, and get to say a proper goodbye to Andrew. So with that, I hand it over to Andrew Clark.
Great, thanks, Len. Hi, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Probably.
Sounded good.
All right, cool. Yeah, so let me just bring up my slides here. Great, okay, so yeah, as Len said, we had wanted to give this presentation about the results of these two projects that we did last year, because we think they're really sort of tangible results from an MPO project, and they're really adding to the conversation both in the region and nationally in terms of some best practices on how people access central business districts and how you allocate curb space in central business districts. So yeah, as one last opportunity to sort of sneak in here under the wire and give this presentation to you all. Thank you for having me. As Len mentioned, I will be departing at the end of this week for Greater Portland Council of Governments as a regional transportation planner there. But I'll make sure to leave my contact info if you have any questions or any follow-up conversation. I'm happy to do that. So let's jump in. The two projects, these were part of last year's UPWP, Transportation Access to Central Business Districts. You'll hear me call that the CBD project, and Future of the Curb. So let's see. Here are the two sort of broad objectives of each of the projects. With the CBD project, we really wanted to know how mode choice varies in the different types of CBDs in the region, because there's really a wide variety. Downtown Boston is very different from downtown Natick or downtown Concord or downtown anywhere like that. So that was one thing we sought to understand. Another was understanding how customers access the region's CBDs, whether they choose transit, whether they walk or bike, whether they drive. And another thing we sought to find out was how merchants perceive their customers to arrive. Because, a lot of times it is the business community that can be apprehensive about rearranging our streets to give more space to bikes or pedestrians or transit service for fear of losing parking, right? And so we sort of wanted to know, how do merchants perceive their customers to arrive, and then how do their customers actually arrive? So that's the first project. The second project was the Future of the Curb, and to an extent the CBD project fed into this, but we wanted to understand how the demand for curb space is changing and how cities are reconfiguring their curbs to accommodate that changing demand. So I'll just go through both of these projects, sort of how we approach them and some of our key high-level takeaways. So first on the CBD project. We started off with a review of the literature of sort of national best practices and looking for other studies and research efforts that had addressed this topic. So we found a number of similar studies that surveyed both customers and merchants as to mode choice and spending patterns and that kind of thing. The similar studies that we found were conducted in high density business districts and commercial corridors, places like Los Angeles, Toronto, Seattle, San Francisco, that kind of thing. And then some key findings from all of those studies were, first off, most customers do not drive, right? So most customers are either biking, walking, or taking transit. most customers are within walking distance, which also makes sense and would lead you perhaps not to choose to drive if you were within walking distance of the downtown. And then we found that non-driving customers visit more frequently and tend to spend more money over time. If you think about it, that kind of makes sense. If you're going to the grocery store in your car and you load up 3 weeks worth of stuff, versus if you stop every day and you get dinner and then you run to this store and you get something over here and you run over this store and you get something over there, over time, you're spending more. Oop. Matt, you there? I appear to have froze.
Oh. I am here. Oh.
Hey, there we go. Maybe there's a delay of some kind. Anyways, so then we thought, okay, how do we take all this good knowledge that we learned from across the country and apply it to the Boston region? So we started by identifying the CBDs in the region because there is no grand list, and sort of downtowns are a fuzzy thing that nobody has a specific definition for. So we built a model that looked for the densest area within each municipality, and we called that the CBD. And that was built off of population density, employment density, the street network density, and the civic use density. And you sort of pile all these layers up on top of each other, and the densest part of the municipality sort of reveals itself. And in most cases, it really did make sense. You say, okay, that's definitely downtown Arlington, downtown, what have you. So we then classified the CBDs based on the types of transit service that they have, and then by overall densities. So we said, okay, if you have rail rapid transit, you're going into this bucket. If you have commuter rail only, you're going into this bucket. If you have no transit, you go into this bucket. Then what was left was the bucket that has that is served by bus, and we separated that out by density into very high density. This was, I want to say, Everett, Chelsea, Somerville, high density, medium density, and then lower, more suburban, lower density suburban locations. Here we go again. Here we go. So then we needed to conduct a fairly extensive data collection effort. We started by releasing a survey to businesses region-wide, asking for their perceptions of their customers' mode choices and spending patterns. Based on the response to this survey and our classification from before, we identified these 4 municipalities to work with and to do further study in their CBDs. So that's Hamilton, Arlington, Framingham, and Hingham. Within each of these CBDs, we conducted customer surveys at each of the businesses that replied to our survey. So then we had that direct comparison between the business estimates and the customers' actual reported answers to those same questions. And lastly, we did curb lane inventories. And for this one, we were looking at sort of high level. Is it parking? Is it metered? Does it have a time limit? Are there bus stops? Are there handicap parking spots? All this sort of stuff to sort of get a sense of how the curb is allocated to different uses. Takes a minute. So here are our key takeaways from this survey. So in Arlington, we did find that merchants overestimated the percentage of their customers that drove. In Arlington and Framingham, merchants underestimated the percentage of their customers within walking distance. So customers were more local than they thought. And drivers spent more than walkers per visit at the business where they were surveyed. However, walkers visited more frequently and visited more businesses per trip. So that goes back to the sort of takeaway from the lit review, was that people who don't drive tend to visit more frequently and tend to spend more over time. And then this comes with a caveat, a pretty significant caveat at that, because the surveying was done really only over one day, and sample sizes were fairly small. So what we do have to sort of say when we present these results is that more data collection would be necessary if we're as an MPO trying to support municipal or any stakeholder decision making. So what that means is if we're going to have a certain conversation in a CBD about can we reallocate some of this space, maybe take a parking lane and put in a bus lane or put in a bike lane, we would need to do more data collection, of course, than based off what we had from the results of this project. But we do see generally the results are in line with national trends. So then that brings me to the next project, which was Future of the Curb. So, you know, the way that cities use and allocate curb space is changing because there are a number of changing demands on the space, whether that's the ride-hail industry creating this demand for passenger pickup and drop-off spaces, or an increase in e-commerce, and so you need more commercial vehicle loading and unloading zones. That's especially true now, right? And then, you know, an interest in improving access and safety and mobility for people using alternative modes of transportation. So improving access for transit or for bike ped infrastructure and that kind of thing. So we really wanted to understand how cities are approaching those challenges and what we could learn from other cities and bring back here to the Boston region. So again, we started with a literature review, and there are two main takeaways. One is that some places are really thinking about curbs from a policy standpoint and a design standpoint. And they are implementing, you know, developing and implementing what's known as a curb management strategy. And that's sort of an official policy document that guides decision-making as to curb lane design and usage. And Seattle was a neat one. They have identified these 6 uses of the curb. And so the curb can be used for mobility. So if you think you step right off the curb, well, that could be a general travel lane. It could also be a bus lane. It could also be a bike lane, anything that's moving people. Access for people. So that could be a bus stop so that people riding the bus can get access to the curb and get access to the restaurants and the shops and so forth. Or it could be a passenger pickup and drop off space for a ride hail company. Access to commerce. So again, that goes back to the improved management of commercial vehicle loading space. Then you have 2 others which are less transportation related, but are important. Community activation. This is stuff like food trucks or you know, seating areas or public art. Greening, and that's a place for street trees or flowers and planters or stormwater infrastructure, that kind of thing. And then storage. And so that would be mostly parking, but also you think of bus layover facility or storage for construction equipment, or, you know, so this sort of framework by Seattle, I think gives us a really good sort of starting point as to how we communicate about what the curb is and what it does and what our priorities should be or could be. Another sort of approach, if you will, is from Portland, Oregon and other places. But Portland, Oregon had a good example of prioritizing total person throughput rather than vehicle throughput of the existing street network. So they know that growth is coming to their downtown, and they don't want to approach that growth by adding new highways and widening lanes and you know, that kind of thing. They want to say, this is our existing street network. How can we optimize it to move the most amount of people possible? And so things like center running high frequency transit lanes, although by being center running, they're not on the curb. So that is kind of a moot point, but those definitely move the most amount of people. And then you could have bus lanes, or you could have bike lanes, you could have wider sidewalks to move more pedestrians, and then general travel lanes. You can see that of those, what is that, 5 different uses, there is a continuum there in how many people you can actually move. And then, of course, the last one, which is what the curb is almost always used for, or probably 75% of the time, parking, but that moves nobody. So if your priority is person throughput of your transportation network, then parking isn't really a great use of that space. And moving on. So then we sort of looked for examples of cities that are redesigning their curbs, reconfiguring their curbs to address some of these problems. So here are some of the major categories, I guess, if you will, of solutions of cities that are approaching these problems. So adding passenger pickup and drop off space, right? So let's have space for the ride hail drivers to scoot off of the road and out of the travel lane so that we can get people in and out of the curb quickly. So there are cities doing that. Improving commercial vehicle loading zone operations. Washington, D.C. was a good example. They created a permit program that a commercial vehicle operator could log on. You get your permit. There's a map that tells you what spaces are available in real time. It is paid. And so it's just sort of this idea of how can we make sure that that limited space that we do have for commercial vehicles is being used in an effective way. So moving people in and out so that you can continue to get those deliveries made on time. Improving multimodal access and safety. So that sort of umbrella is cities that are doing away with parking or doing away with general travel lanes and putting in, say, a bus lane or a bike lane, or widening the sidewalk so now there's more room for higher volume of pedestrians, that kind of thing. And the last one is managing on-street parking. And a really great example of this came out of San Francisco with their demand-based pricing structure, which is that if I go to a block looking for a parking spot, say there's 10 spots along that block, and 10 for 10 are taken. What is that telling me? Well, economically, that's telling me that it's priced too low, so we need to bump that price up. So what was $1 an hour is now $2 an hour, or is maybe $5 an hour. Out in San Francisco, the highest, I think it got out to about $6 an hour, and either they capped it or people said, I'm not paying that, and they go park somewhere else, right? So the other side of that is that if you go to a block and you're looking for a parking spot and they're almost all empty, that might be telling you that it's priced too high. And so you sort of find that sweet spot where most of the parking spots will be taken, but they try to set a threshold of, say, 60 or 80%. So if I'm looking for a parking spot, there will be one. It will just be priced appropriately. So that's sort of managing your on-street parking in a more sort of active way. So key takeaways here from this project was that community should really first define its goals for a particular segment of curb lane and say, you know, you might go back to Seattle's framework and you say, okay, do we want this to be for moving people? Is this an important corridor during the rush hour, say? Or is this a place where we could really activate with some food trucks or some public seating or something like that? So you sort of develop your goal. Then you'll determine the curb's function according to that goal. So again, I'll go back to, is this a major commuting stretch? Okay, we should use this for mobility. We should try to move as many people as possible down this corridor. Now, how do we want to do that? Do we want to do that with a bike lane or a bus lane or a general travel lane? So that's what we mean by determining the curb's function. And then you need to know how to measure success according to those goals. And that's really just about collecting data so you can make good decisions and you can know that you're working towards your goal. Another key takeaway, other cities have tested strategies to make better use of curb space. That's sort of self-evident because I just told you about all the great ideas that cities have and the ways that they're testing things out. But basically, we're saying, along with the next one, go ahead and try something. You know, if anything, and especially now in the COVID situation, if anything, we're learning that curbs can be used in a very flexible way. In the morning, you can do this. In the afternoon, you can do this. In the evening, you can do this. Overnight, you can do something entirely different based on day-to-day, time of day, you know. So testing other strategies and an emphasis on pilot programs. You know, you can do this stuff, you know, sort of on the cheap. You can do it with paint. You can do it with bollards. You can make some changes, and you can see how it goes. And then the last one is municipalities should monitor, evaluate, and adjust curb regulations and their curb management strategies to respond to changing demands. You know, curbs can no longer be a sort of set it and forget it type thing where we just say, okay, this is going to be parking, or this is going to be a commercial vehicle loading zone. You need to really look at the context of that particular segment of curb and try to imagine what might be the most effective way to use it in accordance with your goals. Okay, so I think that's the last slide. Yes, it is. So that's a lot of information because it's 2 projects worth of work jammed into 10-15 minutes. So at this point, happy to take questions and comments. And maybe Len, I'll just turn it over to you to sort of guide the discussion if you like.
Sure thing, Andrew. Thank you very much. And so I see people raising their hands, so I will just unmute, and Matt will be in a backup situation in case I miss someone. Okay, so I see Laura has her hand up, and she should, oops.
Nope, she's muted.
Unmuted. Okay,
No?
hi.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Laura Weiner. I work for the town of Watertown, and I have previously worked for the town of Arlington. And one of the things that has been very perplexing in both communities for me is the loading issues, because first of all, businesses are not at all interested in telling their delivery people to come at a certain time or to coordinate between other businesses. They always, you know, many of them have multiple deliveries.
You might want to do some violins at this.
What?
Sorry, Len just had some background noise. You're all set though.
Oh, okay. So I just was wondering if you came upon any best practices regarding loading zones. That was a long way of asking that question.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think my answer is going to directly reference what you've already acknowledged as being the challenge, because a really great way to try and solve that is with time of day restrictions. And so you could have deliveries, you know, if you have morning rush, and that's going to be a bus lane. And then from 9 to noon, that's when we're going to do our deliveries. We're going to have commercial vehicles in there. And then later on,
really? People do deliveries in their bus stops?
Well, all I mean to say is that if you want to look at the curb as a truly flexible space, you could arrange it such that, you know, different things get priority at different times.
Well, as a bus user, I can assure you, Laura, people do use bus stops as delivery spaces. You shouldn't, but they do. But I know that's not what you meant.
Right. They don't invite it, but I mean, the town would never invite that.
Right, but just to, you know, as an example, the Everett bus lane, I think that's 4 a.m. to 9 a.m. on Broadway inbound during the AM peak. And after 9 a.m., it reverts to parking, and there is probably some commercial vehicle loading space in there. And then, yeah, the buses are in the general travel lane because there's less traffic overall.
I mean, both communities that I work in don't even designate. They just let it happen. And, you know, most of the time it works, and sometimes it doesn't. It's not good for the bikes. It usually blocks the bike lane.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's a tough puzzle to unravel, and there's, you know, a lot of different stakeholders involved, as you say. It's hard to get one business to do something, let alone to try and coordinate 10 along a block, you know, to do something like that. But yeah, really the goal of the project was sort of just get people thinking about what you could do. I will mention the final product was a memo that details, you know, each of those different sort of categories that I had laid out. and give some examples of cities and what they had done, a bit more of their methodology and further reading. So that's up on the MPO's website.
Okay.
And I will forward a link to Matt and Len so that they can push that out so that you can go and read for more information if you're interested.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Good research and very relevant for
Yeah.
me.
So I can also share actually a little bit from the Cambridge context is that when it comes to the question of like, we've been calling it freight loading and all the kind of curb management strategies that I think Andrew has been kind of elucidating. We've definitely taken a look as we do any kind of work at the street, assessing our loading zones wherever we do have them. I think Cambridge is maybe a few steps ahead in having a lot of loading zones designated, and something that we've been hearing from our small business community has been that even before COVID and kind of the reaction to it, that really thinking about curbside access with the rise of Uber Eats and Grubhub and all these kind of delivery services that are app-based has really caused us to take a look anytime we do anything anywhere to just do a quick check of ourselves and test whether we feel like there's enough curbside access. So I know that's not exactly the default position, but I think in terms of a basis of understanding, I think like Andrew said, it's been really helpful for us to be like, we know we could do so much more with a curb, and that framework that Seattle has is super helpful to kind of open up those conversations, but we've definitely looked at it quite hard in many different projects. I think one question that I had for Andrew was whether you saw other frameworks, not so much from a policy perspective, but in terms of how the public perceives some of these changes to the curb. I think, like you said, many people have the idea that the curb is like this immovable, unchangeable, 100%, built in stone kind of thing. And we know, and we're seeing that these things can change and should be responsive to the reality on the street. But I think part of the question for me that I have is how to communicate the benefits of that to a non-technical or non-policy oriented public.
Yeah, well, I think, one way to do that might just be highlighting the conflicts that we do see. The Ubers and the Lyfts are just stopping in the middle of the street to let people in and out. That's not good, and that's something that affects your, if you're driving behind them, that affects you. If you're riding the bus and somebody's unloading in the bus lane, that affects the riders. If the sidewalk's too narrow, and there's too many people, all of this is there, I think, very tangible examples of how, we need to do a better job, I guess, of sharing the space, the very limited space that we have. And so cities should be thinking, and it's good, it sounds like Cambridge very much is, about how do you allocate that space appropriately. And one thing that this brings to mind, I don't know if it answers your question, but I'm just going to sort of throw it out there. One thing that would be really interesting to see further research on is what is called a GTFS for curbs. And so GTFS, for those who don't know, is the General Transit Feed Specification. And it is the way by which transit agencies publish their service, publish their hours, publish their pricing, publish the routes that the vehicles ride on, publish schedules, and all that stuff. So any app that needs to pull transit data is going to read that agency's GTFS files. So what would be great is to have a GTFS for curbs, and municipalities would maintain somehow this database that says, on this segment between here and here, between this time and this time, on this day of the week or whatever, curbs are used for this. If it's parking, then maybe it could say, and it will cost this much at this time, you know? And so you think of all of these apps, Ubers and Uber Eats and transit apps and micro-mobility, you know, shared bike share and all that stuff, could really draw off of that, that feed and then display the information to the public or to the sort of end user in a seamless way, so that we don't have to worry so much about like signs that are 10 feet long that say you can do this at this time and this at this time, but not on this day and only on every third Sunday or whatever, that kind of thing. That would be, I think that would be a really interesting thing to have. And that might be the next sort of thread of research as far as curb management goes. I sort of rambled there, Andy. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
No, I think the idea of the app-based kind of GTFS style thing is totally up Cambridge's alley.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a new look on it that I haven't heard of. I guess one other quick question, since I don't see any other raised hands, is for the kind of business district survey. I was wondering if there's anything that you found that was unexpected in the communities highlighted with the kind of follow-up surveys that you all did. Cambridge, I think, has a pretty robust program of surveying our business districts. So, you know, I haven't found anything totally unremarkable, at least from my perspective. With Cambridge's pretty progressive transportation policies, but I'm wondering if there are some things that you found that were unique that we should consider maybe when we ask our own questions in the business district surveys.
Yeah, I will say those Cambridge surveys really served as a model for how we designed our own customer surveys. And first, what I will say, one thing I found really interesting from those, Andy, was that as I recall, in every location, and there's somewhere like 10, you know, Central Square, Porter Square, Harvard, out by Alewife, East Cambridge, whatever. In every one, people rated access to transit as more important than access to parking, including out by Alewife, which is, you know, mostly suburban, you know, Petco and Trader Joe's and that kind of thing. So that really jumped out to me as, wow, that's super interesting. As far as our own data collection efforts, I hesitate to draw too much of a conclusion because we really did run into sample size problems. So we have tried to stay as much sort of big picture as we can. With that said, I am pleased to see that the results sort of match, you know, the national experience. And I think a lot of these types of projects are, you go out, you do research, you find all these great ideas, and then you come back to the local context and you say, what about this idea? What about this idea? And you can be met with, no, that won't work here. We're different. It's not gonna work. And it's just, it's sort of sad, I guess, or a little deflating because it sort of stops a conversation before it even gets started. So all that to say, I was glad to see that by and large, our findings match the national level findings.
Cool. Thanks. Anyone else? Well, I have a question, Ed. So were in the curb, I'm sorry, the second one, what is it called? Something about the curb. The
Future of the curb?
Future of the curb, thank you. Were there any cases where people had bump outs, but the buses didn't like pull into the parking lane to get riders in and let riders off?
So you mean like at a crosswalk, you've got a curb extension, and then just past that crosswalk, you have a bus stop, but the buses don't pull fully out into that bus stop?
Or that there's a bump out and that the bus kind of like pulls up to the bump out, so it doesn't like pull into the parking lane, so that the bus doesn't have to like get.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I know that there are design guides that suggest that. I can't with 100% certainty say that I saw that. If I did, it was probably in San Francisco because they do that kind of stuff out there. But yeah, that is becoming, I think, sort of national best practice on design, is just have a curb extension for your bus stop so that the bus can just pull to the stop. It stops in the travel lane, but that's fine because maybe, 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 people are getting on or off at that particular spot, and that may inconvenience 1 or 2 drivers behind them. But again, that goes back to what's a community's priority. Is it moving people, or is it moving vehicles, or is it something else? So yeah, I think that's becoming more common, Len.
Okay, I was just wondering if there were any studies so that saw how it worked and how it was accepted. So okay, cool, thank you. And I'll just add, that it's really worth reading the final reports that Andrew did on these. And my understanding is that there is going to be a follow-up study on the CBD one, right?
On both of them, actually.
Okay,
yeah.
great.
So there will be additional surveying conducted in a new set of CBDs throughout the region. And sort of part 2 of Future of the Curb is going to look at how to develop a curb management strategy. So in the ways that, Seattle has developed this framework and developed this sort of vocabulary for talking about what curbs are and what we can do with them. We intend to do a little research on sort of how that process can unfold and how MPOs can support that kind of work. So if a municipality is interested in developing and implementing its own curb management strategy, bless you, they'll be able to do that.
Great, thanks. Sorry about that. It's the open office format here. Sorry. so that wasn't me sneezing, but the blessing is appreciated. Anyway.
He's still blessed.
Yeah. So I'm not seeing any other questions. So is a way of closing this out, Andrew? If you have any parting remarks for me for RTAC or the MPO in general that you want to share publicly, that's fine. As I said in my email, and I welcome anything that you want to say privately too. But it's been a pleasure working with you, Andrew. One of the reasons I'm holding back, I don't have that many questions, is that Andrew has participated as the CTPS representative on the Capital Investment and Finance Subcommittee of the Ryder Roadside Committee. So he meets with us every month, and so we were able to talk about these studies more extensively in our subcommittee meetings, and it's just really been great having Andrew as a part of the ROC subcommittee meetings. So I'm glad he was able to present here to RTAC.
Yeah, and I am too. So thank you all for having me.
Okay, folks. Well, thanks everyone for joining this extra meeting. I hope you found it worth the while, and we can talk more about whether we do more of these in the future as opposed to the past, and take it from there. So I'll see you all in 2 weeks, and unless anyone has something else they want to say, we'll end the meeting. I'm not seeing any hands.
Nor am I. Andrew, thank you so much for coming. So very much appreciated.
Okay.
Welcome. Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye.